Every game that has distinct classes or attributes has certain themes, strengths, and weaknesses associated with those classes or attributes. Typically, this is done to introduce variance and different axes of play. This is the same in Pokémon Pocket, with each energy type having a distinct advantage over others through support for that energy type. In this video, we will look at the first three types of energy: grass, fire, and water, and look at what they are set up to accomplish in the game, and how they accomplish it through various examples of cards released thus far. If you like this and want to see me cover lightning, psychic, and fighting, like this video and subscribe. Grass. Theme: healing and tanking. Grass is your classic tank class, boasting the highest non-mega HP, with Venusaur EX clocking in at 190 HP. Venusaur EX is a phenomenal ambassador of the grass type. Not only does it have an extremely beefy HP stat, it also heals 30 damage from itself when using the Giant Bloom attack. Furthermore, it can receive healing support from Erica, which heals grass-type Pokemon for 50 HP, and Shaman from Spacetime Smackdown, which heals each of your Pokemon for 10 HP. Healing isn't the only thing grass does, obviously. Even though there are cards now that have a higher HP total than Venusaur EX alone, Venusaur EX still has the highest HP total when a complete board is set up. Leaf Cape, released in Celestial Guardians, brings its HP to 220, and if you have two of the Lilligants from Mega Rising, their Toughness Aroma abilities stack, bringing Venusaur up to a whopping 260 HP, outclassing everything else in the game. Adding to that the healing effect Venusaur has, and it can become a monster. However, that is a very load-bearing can in that sentence. This requires a lot of setup, and while yes, grass is objectively the best at healing and tanking, as per usual this means the DPS from grass and the speed at which grass can operate is greatly reduced. Once set up, grass is a monster, but there is very little helping these behemoths get going. Unlike water, electric, fire, and psychic, there is no native draw power, so you have to use cards like Copycat, Professor's Research, or Pokeball to draw through your deck. And when adding in Leaf Cape and Erica, you start to get a very tight deck list that would struggle to run more than 2 complete lines of Pokemon. So the choice between consistency and power ceiling is one that grass decks leading into their theme have to contend with. Overall, the weakness of grass's early game has historically kept it out of high-level meta contention, because it doesn't really matter if eventually you are unkillable. Something else will knock you out before you get to that position. This is why the actually meta-relevant grass cards, such as Meowscarada, Blastoise EX, and Decidueye EX, lead into speed and comparatively low damage thresholds, rather than the tankiness that grass is known for in the game. Fire. Theme: burst damage. Fire boasts some of the highest non-conditional damage thresholds in the game. Sure, Celebi EX can go infinite, as can cards with the psychic attack like Jinx and Indeedee EX, but there is yet to be a card, like Charizard EX from Genetic Apex, that does 200 damage straight up. In fact, many of the fire-type cards outclass their peers when it comes to damage. Think of Turtonator from Celestial Guardians, or Mega Blaziken EX from Mega Rising as other examples of high damage relative to energy cost for their class. However, each one of these cards has the same effect to balance out their attack, which is discarding fire-type energy. This discarding effect makes it so that the damage threshold for fire is quite high, but is very fragile. For example, if Ninetales in the Blaine deck is KO'd, it is very difficult to get a second attacker up and running relative to the other types, since energy had to be consistently invested in Ninetales to keep up with attacks each turn. Sure, it attacks for a lot, but if that isn't enough to KO, you're in trouble. That said, there are quite a few fire support cards that try to mitigate this downside. Kiawe and Flame Patch both ramp fire energy onto your cards. Kiawe puts 2 fire energy on Turtonator and ends your turn, while Flame Patch takes a fire energy from your discard pile and attaches it to your active fire-type Pokemon. In addition, Moltres EX can preemptively ramp fire energy onto cards on your bench so you have enough resources to fire off multiple moves that require a discard. All that said, the fire type is perhaps the most clearly defined type when it comes to strengths and weaknesses. If you can KO your opponent with your burst damage before they can respond in kind, you will win. If not, you will lose. While that works in slower and lower power formats, like what we saw in Genetic Apex, as the game is sped up, that giant burst of damage is no longer feasible in the metagame. Hence why a lot of what has been meta relevant recently, such as Steamzard from Shiny Revelry, follows a different path. In the case of Steamzard, this version of Charizard not only self-ramps, but it also doesn't require a discard of energy, at the cost of doing 50 less damage. This consistency fills the main weakness of the fire type, and led to Steamzard's meta relevance during the formats in which it was played. More recently, Mega Blaziken's playability comes from both yes, its high damage, but also its high HP pool. Because its attack requires only 2 energy, you can have Mega Blaziken dishing out 140 damage a turn on your second turn of energy very consistently. Coupled with a 210 HP stat, and even if you don't take out your opponent right away, you likely won't have to pivot to a different Pokemon, meaning you can continue to pump energy into Mega Blaziken turn after turn, thus fulfilling what the type is actually trying to do, albeit not in the huge one-attack mode that Genetic Apex Charizard did back in the day. Water. Theme, ramp. Water is very clearly the ramping type. While fire does large amounts of damage relative to their energy cost, water typically requires large amounts of energy to do damage. Water-type cards typically fall into 2 categories. Cards where the energy requirement to attack is high, and cards where they do additional damage once certain energy thresholds are met. Let's take a look at the latter first. These kinds of cards typically have a plus symbol next to the energy requirement for their attacks, and text detailing how much energy is required for how much additional damage. Think of Blastoise EX and Lapras from Genetic Apex, or Primarina EX. Each of these cards hit their damage thresholds if you ramp beyond what the energy requirement is on the card. Functionally, this means they typically deal a little bit less damage than their counterparts at the same cost. Think Lapras doing only 20 damage for 1 energy instead of the typical 30. They're also a little bit lower than damage when they actually fulfill the text requirements as well. This is because they gain a lot of power and flexibility, which can offset this downside. The other group of water-type cards are the ones with a high base energy requirement. Typically, these cards are like nearly all renditions of Gyarados, requiring 4 energy to do a big attack. These cards lack the flexibility of the previous pool, but do more damage or have powerful secondary effects, such as removing energy or discarding cards from your opponent. Typically, this has been the Achilles heel of water, as the game is sped up. The metagame definitely favors cards that are all in line with 1 or 2 energy, not 3 or 4. That is just too much investment in something that can be removed relatively easily, or otherwise is inconsistent. Granted, many water-type Pokemon have higher than average HP pools, and have healing support from cards like Primarina and Irida that allow them to continue ramping. But in many cases, especially post-Celestial Guardians, water struggled to keep up with the other types. Keeping water in the game up until that point was the large amount of water-type ramp that was available. Misty was the first easily accessible energy ramp card in the game, and theoretically could put 5 energy on your Pokemon turn 1, leading to a lot of very toxic battles that ended in their first turn during Genetic Apex format. In addition, Manaphy released in Spacetime Smackdown, allowing for consistent ramp of 2 different Pokemon, with water energy each turn. Obviously, the introduction of Mantike helped with water generation as well, as did Jellicent. But by the time Secluded Springs and Mega Rising came around, water in the meta had taken on a different appearance. Water's current place in the meta is based on different Pokemon's individually strong abilities. Think of cards like Suicune EX, Greninja EX, and regular old Greninja. Each of these have a powerful ability and relatively high damage thresholds, and none of them require more than 2 energy. As previously mentioned, the 2 energy threshold is extremely prevalent in the meta, and these water-type cards fulfill that to a T. However, unlike their earlier counterparts, these 3 water-type cards don't typically run any water ramp, and instead they shift the type away from ramp almost entirely to a new kind of hero playstyle, where the individual cards matter a lot more than their support does. It'll be interesting to see if this change remains consistent, or if water reverts back to its theme of ramping over time to dish out consistently high damage. So that concludes the first part of our type theming series. Let me know what you think down below, and if you agree or disagree with how the cards are categorized. Obviously, not every card fits into each theme, but generically this is how the type is viewed in broad strokes. It is interesting how consistent the design space has been with each type, and I hope there continues to be a dividing line between types to keep each type unique and interesting across the board.